welcome to today's live. Today is actually day 6 of the Creative Vulnerability series. In fact, let me put it in the comments and let me pin the comments. And yeah. Dr. Varun Gandhi, my guest today is here. So go ahead and request to be on the live. I see your request. Excellent. All right. So.
Hello.
Hello.
How you doing?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah.
I've been wearing this headband.
Yeah. You have a new style now. I saw you wear another one yesterday too.
Yeah. So I have these different ones with me. I just
Yeah.
just got this one today, so I put it on right before this live, and I got a couple others with me. So these are like headbands,
Oh,
and
cool.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
they have some kind of design.
Oh, nice. They have some interesting
This one's the
design.
chakras, the 7 chakras here.
Oh,
This
right.
the
Yeah.
crown, the
Yeah.
third eye, the vocal, and then all the rest are there. And then I got this one that has a nice quote at the bottom.
Oh, nice.
It says,
Very
"Love
cool.
is my religion."
Oh, right. Yeah. Ziggy Marley.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ziggy Marley wrote a song. He has a song with that title.
Oh, okay. That's probably where it's from then. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, and the reason I do that, um, I was watching someone who on YouTube, there's a video on YouTube, and he was saying that uh, you'll see a lot of gurus or like priests, they have a headband, or any religious figure, they'll have a head.
Yeah, that's why I called it Rumal because it reminds me of the Rumal at the Gurdwara.
Yeah,
So when I saw
yeah.
it yesterday, yeah.
And the reason they do that is because it activates your energy centers that are right around here, which
Mm.
when you're praying or when you're meditating, it's like this is your crown chakra. Like when they put a crown on a king or a queen, it sits right here and it's activating these energy centers right here. So it's like holding this and keeping it tight so that when I'm meditating, I'm like connected with the crown, and that's opening up. That's the reason I wear this.
Oh,
Yeah. And
that's
same thing for the hat. The hat does that too because it's like, hat puts pressure.
great. Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
restricting. As long as there's a little bit of pressure right here in this area, then that's strengthening your crown chakra.
yeah. Yeah, I've been wearing this hat in every life for the last few months. Like it just makes me feel good.
Yeah, there's my hat right here that
Right. Yeah.
I want to retire it. That's the one that I've been using for a while now.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
so now it's time to move on to something different. So I've been looking for other hats, but in the meantime, I'm going to use this.
Yeah, it sort of also creates your own kind of, I guess
Yeah.
in marketing terms, your own brand identity.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
I've been looking for hats that have some kind of design like this, like the chakras or
Um,
something like spiritual. I've been looking for the hats like you're wearing, something like that kind of shape, but with some sort of design on something on it. But I haven't
You
been able.
can make your own. I actually have this designed on my own. This is using a 3D fabric paint. So on one side it says B, and on the other side it says true. So it's be true.
Oh wow! Wait, how did
Yeah.
you do that?
Huh?
How did you do that?
And then right in the middle is another design, right? There is like a triangle, upside down triangle.
Yeah.
How did I do that? Let me show you. By the way, this t-shirt is also painted in the same way. So you can see it's a spiral in the middle, and then there's like flower leaves, petals coming out.
Okay.
Yeah. So I paint my t-shirts in the same way I painted this hat. So I have this thing. Let me show you. I use this 3D fabric paint.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I've had this for about at least 3 years now, I think.
Oh wow.
And it's very cool because you don't need a brush. You can just squeeze it. because it's very
Oh,
controlled. It comes out in a very controlled way.
oh, so you could just squeeze it as, then that's like the brush you're painting with that, with the
Yeah,
bottle.
I paint with that, with the bottle itself. Yeah,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sometimes when I want even more control, like when I want the paint to be kind of a little bit thinner, that's when it hurts my fingers a little bit, but it's worth it, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you have to be a little precise. It's like a surgeon. Like you're
right,
right.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. In fact, it reminds me of I forgot who said this, but like one way to discover your passion is to ask yourself, what are you willing to suffer for?
Yeah.
Because everything comes with a certain amount of
Like,
emotional and sometimes even physical pain. Like with writing, you might have writer's block and have frustration with that, for example.
right.
And if you do like martial arts, then you're gonna be hit several times, etc. Right? But the question is like some things are worth it despite the pain,
Mm,
uh, whereas others are like uh, this is too much for me. And once you start feeling that it's really is too much for real, that's when you know that's not your passion. Like,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It's been like for me, I think you may have noticed this as well. That so I started my YouTube channel about 4 or 5 years ago, and this was like I think 2017, and I put out a bunch of videos during that time, but it was only for a month. It was all of June I put out videos because 4th of July I had some presentation that I was sort of preparing for. Then after that I didn't come back to it all the way until the following year around the same time. Next June I started doing interviews. I think I had interviewed you along with at that time. That was my first set of interviews, the very first set I did. And I only got to like 4 or 5 interviews and then I kind of walked away from it. And again, I got back to it in 2020. So that was year after year, around the same time, I would come back to it,
mhm.
realizing like, hey, this is what I want. Yeah, there was so the reason I would come away from it is like step away from it is because there was a lot of pain. There was a lot of friction while I was going through that process of creating those videos,
Yeah.
and so because of that, I would step away from it, and then but something would draw me back. Something would pull me back and be like, okay, there's something here that I want to explore. So then I would come back to it the next year, again, do it for a short bit, have a lot of friction, then run away from it. Then again, the following year, I came back to it, 2020. And in 2020, I created a new style of, instead of doing the interviews, I was doing like panel discussions. So I'd have 4 or 5. I think you'd come on for one of those topics as well, cultural yoga appropriation. And so then I started doing that, and it just evolved. But it all came to me as like ideas that I wanted to implement, but it was also me stretching outside of my comfort zone. So it was a little bit of like push and pull. But now I'm finally getting to a place after 4 years of all of that pain and all of that, going through the growth process, that I've now been very comfortable of being in front of a camera and speaking without hesitating, without thinking twice, without having a script to read from. So
Mhm.
it's taken that time, but it was a lot of pain along that process, and kind of like what you were mentioning, that there's that pain that what are you willing to suffer or sacrifice to go through this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you experimented with different formats, but overall you were doing, the same line of work, right? So basically you persisted, you experimented with different formats to define what's like the most joyful, the most fulfilling for you, right? But the fact that you still persisted in generally the same thing shows that and it's been like 4 years, like you said. So it shows that there's is something that you're willing to, to sacrifice something for, to suffer a few little bit of friction for. So this is most likely, it most likely is your passion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a time where I was like really deeply into meditation, and I would meditate like a 9 to 5 job. So during that time, the question in my mind was, like, what's my purpose, or what am I doing here in the grand scheme of things? And the thing that came to me was speaker. Like, you are a
Mm,
speaker, and you're here to
right, yeah.
share your truth. And just knowing me, and my greatest challenge has been expressing myself.
Mm,
And it's only been in the last 6 months, I would say, but more so in 2022, that I've been very comfortable and getting more at ease in sharing myself in different situations. This is an interview, sort of like the conversation we're having on Instagram. Maybe last year, this would have been a lot of there would have been a lot of friction in right now, and I wouldn't have shared as much as I'm sharing with you right now.
mhm.
But now there's so much at ease during this process.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, right? Because in marketing, we talk about niching up versus niching down, right? But we do start with something broad to have that general idea first. In your case, it's speaker, right? And then now you've like kind of, in marketing terms, kind of niche down a little bit more and become more specific, right? But what's interesting about what you've done is uh, it shows me, that some people can do things like on their own, like, kind of originate. Whereas people like me, for example, I need a reflection. And it sounds like you are similar, like you need a guest to reflect back to you, right? Like with my poetry, I've been writing a lot lately because I figured out for me as well that I need that reflection. So what I do is I would write down, and there's a good segue into, what we're going to talk about, right? The creative process, where I write down my, yeah, I use a process, a version of bibliomancy where I pick out the top three books in the morning that draw me, and I turn the page, and I write down like the lines or the verses or poems, if it's a poetry book, that jump out at me when I turn that page, and I write it down in my journal to have that muscle memory. And so that's my prep work. So before I even write a single line of my own poetry, I do that prep work first, because now that I understand that there are indeed four stages of the creative process, there is that preparation, which is, what I do is an example of that. Then I just leave it, like, and that leaving it and forgetting about it is the incubation stage. And that can be a few hours, a few days, a few months, maybe even a few years. Like one person that really fascinates me regarding this is the singer Sade, who, who is famous in her own circles, but a lot of people haven't heard of her because she takes 6 to 10 years between coming out with an album, right? Her last album was in 2010. She
Mm.
did come out with a single for a Disney movie, A Wrinkle in Time, A Flower of the Universe, and that's because Disney specifically hired her for that one song. That was in 2018. But other than that, like, there's been no album since 2010, and then the album before that was in 2001 or 2000.
Wow.
So, and yet I feel like because of that, like her songs are just timeless. They're just amazing, because she took the time, you know, to really prepare herself to really have that incubation period as well. And yeah, and I think a lot of creatives, especially in the United States with our instant gratification culture, right? If things don't come quickly enough or fast enough, we think we have writer's block, when in reality, you just might need more time for incubation.
Mm.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish between that time for incubation versus writer's block?
Yeah, so it's another way to ask that question is how do you like distinguish between resistance and incubation, right?
Mm.
And, and in fact, Sade has an answer to that. I actually wrote this down when I was doing some research on her uh, when she
And I,
said,
the reason I've
uh,
heard of her, I have heard of her, and the reason I've heard of her is because my brother-in-law listens to her, and I think we were listening to a song by her, and I was really attracted to it. It was a really good song. I don't remember which one it was. I asked him who it was, and he said Sade, and then we started looking up more about her and
oh, right.
diving deeper. So yeah,
Yeah,
I have heard of her.
yeah. Because she's so seclusive, she's actually more famous for her songs than for herself. You
Mm,
know, like
yeah.
if I tell you her songs, you would recognize it, like Smooth, I think Smooth Lover or Smooth Operator is
Hmm.
an iconic song, and almost everybody have heard of that song, you know.
Right, 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 right.
But they haven't heard of her, which is
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, she said you can only grow as an artist as long as you allow yourself the time to grow as a person. And so even if it turns out that writer's block is a form of resistance, right? That can be a good sign. It's just feedback. It's data, right? If you just see it as data, you can be more neutral about it. Then you just see it as, oh, if I'm having this resistance, this piece needs me to grow as a person, this thing I'm working on. So I need a little bit more life experience and then come back. So that's another way to frame it too for me.
Mm. Yeah, and I've noticed that that's true for me as well. That writing has been like writing a book has been something that I've wanting to do for a long time, like publishing my own book. I mean,
Right.
this that I published during my dissertation for my PhD, but that doesn't count. That's not what I'm looking at. And so this has been like a 7-year journey of me wanting to write a book. Actually, even probably longer, like 2013. It's almost 9-year journey now, and I'm finally getting to a point of, all right, I'm ready to write the book because it took that time, maybe of incubation. It took that time of sitting down with the idea and like research, like understanding what the idea is like. So the idea has been formulating over this time, for my first book over the last 6 years, 7 years, and now it's like gotten to a point where okay, I've written it down, created like a little course out of it, digital course out of it, and now I'm finally getting to the point of okay, the structure is there, so I can write the book now. Yeah, and so that it's been a journey of just getting to this point of okay, I'm ready to write this book. But there was a lot of friction before, partly
Mhm.
because maybe the idea wasn't completely formulated, and it was like yeah, it was half baked, half cooked, and so I felt like all this while this is not ready. The idea is not ready, and so because of the idea is not ready, then the book just can't be written.
Right, exactly. It needed a little more time for incubation,
Yeah, yeah.
and possibly verification too, because the stages are not necessarily in order, right?
What are
Uh,
the stages? What are the other two? So
so there's preparation, then there's incubation, then there's illumination, when that's when you have that quick flash of insight, and then there is verification and implementation, right? And and it's not, even though it's written in that order, it's not always in that order, it's not always linear. I think a good example of it not being entirely linear is, and I've mentioned this in several other lives too, the story of how Paul McCartney from the Beatles, right? How he came up with the iconic song "Yesterday," right, which is like, this very famous song. And apparently for him, the melody came first, and the melody came to him in a dream, right? And so for him, in a way, the illumination stage came first, the flash of insight came first, right? And and here's the thing, though. This is the difference between that flash of insight or that inspiration coming to an amateur versus an experienced artist, right? He was kind of ready, right, to
yeah,
receive inspiration. And this reminds me of a movie on Kurara, the famous Japanese artists. Again, that's another example of somebody whose work you've probably seen, but you've never heard of her. Like you've probably seen the famous picture of the water waves in front of Mount Fuji. It's in many dental offices and hotel lobbies. Like I've
Yeah,
seen it everywhere.
yeah, yeah.
The painter, I hadn't heard of until I watched the movie, a documentary about her. Right, so Rara worked for her artist father, who was also a famous painter, Hakusai. And back in the day, like before you get to be as famous as Hakusai, even his own daughter, Kurara, worked as an apprentice, and there were many other apprentices who would painstakingly copy brushstroke by brushstroke Hakusai's style before even painting their own originals,
Mm,
before even, doing anything that's about their own inspiration, right? So they were building up their skill to match their inspiration, which, by the way, may never match 100%, but the point is the journey, to keep trying, right? Because there was a point in that movie when Kurara became really, really frustrated that she wasn't skilled enough yet, right? And yet she was getting this amazing inspiration, right? So
mm,
her skill did not match her inspiration, right? And at that point, Hakusai was already age 70, and he'd been an artist for many years. In fact, he kept painting until he was about 95. He lived until 95. But at age 70, he told her daughter, who was being frustrated, "Hey, look, I'm 70 and I'm still practicing. I'm still trying to match my skill to my inspiration, right?" So back to Paul McCartney's story. Now, because this was before Google, before Spotify, before Shazam, right? He didn't know if the song was an original, right? So in order to make sure it was an original, he started playing the melody, right? The melody, because he hadn't got the lyrics yet. The melody in front of many of his musician friends. He kept playing this everywhere. Of course, he didn't play it at the concerts yet, but he would play it in small groups privately. And it took 18 months between him hearing the melody in the dream and actually the lyrics coming in. So right there, there's lots of prep work, but there's also a lot of verification, right? So again, the order is kind of reversed. The illumination came first, then he was doing the verification. But by doing the verification, he was also practicing a lot.
right,
This melody over and over again
right.
was now deep in his mind, deep in his muscle memory, right? So 18 months later, he took a break. He went to a fishing village where no one knew him except this old friend who knew him before he became famous, which was key, right? So now he's going into the incubation phase, right? A total break. And for him, as somebody famous, this total break was necessary for him to get out of his own ego, his own self-image, right? And it was key that he was talking to a friend who knew him before he became famous, right?
Yeah.
So this fishing village, as they started talking about the yesterdays of their lives, the past.
Mm,
And that's when the lyrics slowly started coming through. And that's
mm,
why it's called Yesterday.
mm. Interesting.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
so while he was like preparing and just playing, finally he got to the point of understanding what lyrics would fit this melody, and
Exactly.
it came to him, and then he wrote the song. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I feel like in different creative avenues, the process will change, right? Like
Right.
the order will change. It's a very loose structure. It's not like it's gonna be go from one, two, three, four, five. It could be
Right.
anywhere.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I'm creating design work, for example, for designing all my products, then I have a creative process around that as well,
Mm.
and that looks a little different from like the structure is different from other creative processes. And
Mm.
so in there, I'm like one common process that I use for my creativity is uh, I clear my mind completely. So like I'm meditating and I'm everything that's attached to me at that time, I'm dropping it. right? So I like visualize dropping everything and letting everything go. So I'm completely like empty, right?
Mm,
Blank slate basically. And then I hold a vessel. The
mm.
vessel is what the creative avenue. Like, okay, I am going to be creating around this topic, around this business, around this idea, or if it's a blog post, I'm creating around that blog post, and this is the topic. So I have a vessel that I'm sort of using my creativity for, and then I start filling the vessel with different ideas, flashes of insights, things that come up at that time. And so it's a 10, 15, 20, 30 minute process, however long it takes. And through this time, I'm recording myself in some way. So it's either a voice recording and I'm channeling it, recording my voice, or I'm writing things down in my journal. Recently, I've upgraded from a pen and paper journal to this thing called the Remarkable.
Oh yeah, I've seen a YouTube ad for that. Uh,
Yeah. Uh,
yeah.
and it's a digital journal, a digial
Right,
diary.
and you can erase it and stuff. Yeah.
You can erase it, but it has a lot, like I think 8 gigs of storage. So there's a
Oh
lot.
wow. So you can also save it in the
Yeah,
memory.
keep
Yeah.
saving it, and so it's basically you have notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of stuff in this one thing. You don't have to
Oh
carry
wow.
hundreds different notebooks. It's all your notes on one thing, and you can just carry this one thing around.
That
Um,
is.
it has the
Yeah.
same effect of writing. It has the same effect of taking notes, flipping pages. The only thing I miss is, and this is what I may have valued in writing on paper, is the crinkling sound of the paper when I write on it and then I turn the page, that crinkling sound.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I miss that. Otherwise, I think it's a great substitute for journaling, for writing any kind, anything. It also helps with, it has different templates. And so if I want to plan my day, plan my week, then it has a template for the whole week and I can schedule
Oh, that's so
that.
cool.
I have like, um, so this is like April week 1, and then I flip the next page, go to week 2. So every month I have like a document that I write down everything that I'm doing on, or everything that I want to accomplish for the day, my goals for the day, and that's kind of how I keep track. So I write down all my ideas in there, flashes of insights. Maybe it comes out as a drawing or a diagram, like an image that I have to sketch. So all of it's in there, and it's been a great replacement. But yeah, that's kind of my process, is clearing my mind, holding this vessel for whatever the topic for the day is, and then whatever flashes of insights, ideas that come in, I start writing it down, and then it's like I get into the creation mode and start putting things together. If it's writing a blog post, and I start typing, putting content together, gathering information, and I get started in that way. But that's how I get my main like creation of the idea. Okay, this is how it's going to go about, and after that, once I have that, then it becomes much easier to start implementing each of those steps.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. That reminds me of another creative process, and that's from this was what I was using before I discovered the four stages of creativity by Graham Wallace. This is by Spontaneous Creativity by Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who is a Tibetan indigenous Buddhist teacher. And he talks about he also talks about how there are mainly two ways to create. One is, and I found that this is true for me as well, where either I can dive into my belly, which is the navel chakra, right? And feel the energy of it and see like what's been already cooking for a long time. That just something positive and powerful, right? That just needs a little push, and I just give it that push, right? So for me, that's the only situation when the quick flash of insight comes, right? But even in that case, the reason why it comes so quickly is because I am trying to express something that already has had years of preparation and incubation that's been happening in the background unbeknownst to me. An example of that is a few days ago, I wrote a poem called Intertwine, and it came very quickly. I didn't even need to prepare. But the reason is because as I was writing, I was thinking about the poem Joy and Sorrow by Khalil Gibran from his book The Prophet. And and that poem has been deep in my memory for years, for almost a decade probably. So I've been reading and rereading that poem again and again, off and on for years, and thinking about it for years. So because of that, the poem came so quickly, right? Because the process has been already working. But if that's not the case, that's when you need some sort of process, right? Whether it be the four stages of creativity, like Graham Wallace, or the five-step process here in this book, Spontaneous Creativity. And the five-step process, the first step is very similar to what you said. You basically, there's a practice called sky gazing where uh, you become aware of the space above your crown chakra, right? And you look at the space between you and the sky. So even though it's called sky gazing, what you're actually doing is gazing at the akash, the space, the multidimensional space between you and the sky. And he even recommends making a sound called ah, which opens up your crown, right? But you can sometimes do it even without making the sound. So the ah helps dissipate any resistance or tension that's happening to clear the space even more, to feel even more spacious. Then you go down, so that's connecting to openness. Then you go down your throat chakra, and there's another sound for that. I think the sound for that is Om, right? And then that's when you get in touch with awareness, right? He also calls it the silence, right? The inner silence.
Mm.
And in fact, the openness helps you get in touch with an inner stillness. And then you go down into your heart, and in your heart, that openness and the awareness combines in the heart and becomes kind of like a spaciousness inside the heart. And it also becomes like a focus point because when it's just openness and awareness, it's like a zero. It's like a 0 point field, right? But when it gets into the heart, the zero transforms into infinity. It's like infinity and zero are two sides of the same coin. Because now you get in touch with what he calls the 84,000 positive qualities, including the four immeasurables, right? Love, compassion, equanimity, and joy. And you get to decide which out of the four or the 84,000 ways of being or qualities of being that you want to express now. And you make a choice. It's the choice point in the heart. So it's more like slightly more abstract, right? Because you're basically trying to express a feeling or a way of being.
Yeah.
And then once you made a choice, then you go down into your belly, and that's when you start cooking, uh, making it more grounded. So if it's joy that you want to express, you make it even more joyful in the belly, right?
Mm.
Cooking it. And then you go into what he calls the secret chakra, which is about 2 inches below the navel and right above the pelvis, right? I think in Qigong it's called Dantian.
Mm.
So instead of seven, it's basically a five chakra process. Uh, so this is why I say there are different chakra systems. The seven is not the only one. In pranic healing, which I'm trained in, there are actually 11 chakras, right? 11 major ones. So in
So
his process, there are five,
when
right?
you fifth one, the last one, what do you do in that?
Huh?
So when you get to the fifth one, like in the creativity process, when you get to the fifth level or the fifth chakra, what do you do there?
So that's the action chakra. That's the expression chakra. So
Oh,
once it's already cooked, that's the chakra that gives you the power, the energy. It's like a rocket ship, that the energy to express what's been cooked.
okay.
Yeah.
I always thought the vocal chakra was what uh,
Hmm.
expresses what you cook.
Well, the vocal chakra is the actual mechanism that expresses, right? But the energy behind it
Oh, the act.
comes from basically from around the pelvis area, but right above it. Yeah.
Got it, got it. Oh, okay, okay, wow. Okay, so that's like the thing that's gonna light the fire.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the
Part,
fuel. Yeah.
part.
The spark. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's a interesting process. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I may try that actually. I'm really interested in this.
Mhm.
Because it's like you said, it's taking a focal point, which is that energy or the feeling that you want to express, right?
Exactly.
Art chakra, you're taking that as a focal point, and then um, allowing your all of your insights and your research and everything that you know thus far to cook in your belly around that focal point of the feeling, and then you start expressing it in
Mhm.
energy. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I got this. Yeah, I highly recommend this book to everyone, Spontaneous Creativity. By the way, it's a very quick read. It's only 130 pages.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. And I got this in 2018, and so it's been 4 years of me reading and rereading this book. And since then, I've read at least like five other books by the same author. And so I've gone deep into his work. And I feel like, but this book especially has been life-changing as a creator because it made me it made me a truly multi-creative person. I was multi-passionate before, but I wasn't as fully expressed in my different passions. But this book taught me that whatever I'm expressing is actually the same thing. I'm expressing, the feeling that comes from that open space. And how I express it, whether it's through painting or dance or writing, it doesn't actually matter because that's just the vehicle, the
Mhm.
vessel that you're saying. But in reality, what's actually being expressed is that feeling that was in the heart.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's what the other person has to like. You want to convey that to the other person as well. And
Exactly.
that's what a well told. Sorry about that. And a well told story is when the audience can actually feel that emotion,
Exactly.
right? Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's this some research around storytelling.
Hmm.
This is why I really love storytelling. That so this is how the experiment goes, right? So they took this lady who can speak English and Russian, and they asked her to narrate a story in both languages. Same story that was narrated in English and narrated in Russian. And they recorded this whole thing. While they were recording her voice, they were also recording her brain activity and what parts of the brain were getting activated, right? And then they took that audio and had a bunch of participants listen to it. Some of them knew only English, and some of them knew only Russian. And what they did is, while they were listening to it, they also tracked their brain scans as well. And they found out that while they were listening to the story in the English, the people who understand English, while they were listening to the story in English, the same regions in the brain were activated as that lady who was narrating the story. So even though the person narrating the story and the audience was not in the same room, it was an audio that they were listening to, she was able to convey those emotions to the other person because based on the brain scans. When they understood the language, but when they didn't understand the language, when they heard the Russian, those areas were not activated
Oh.
when gaining the meaning behind it, right? And so the storytelling is so powerful that by sharing the story, you can make a person feel a certain way. And it's yeah, and that's why I really enjoy storytelling and sharing my stories, but also interviewing people and having them share their stories.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I love storytelling too. I studied the neuroscience very deeply. And now I have a third page called Story for a Cause, where I teach storytelling to activists, basically. Uh,
Mm.
but now I'm focusing on helping climate justice activists because I feel like it's the most urgent issue of our times, especially with uh, like the fact that by 2030, about 10 major cities around the world will be underwater, right? So things like that. Uh, we'll have desertification of everywhere in the world will be desert in about 50 years because of swell loss. things like that. So yeah, storytelling is more urgent than ever because of that. Because as Lisa Cron said in her book Story Genius, and also in her book Story or Die, that basically story isn't how we escape reality, but actually how we navigate reality.
Mm.
It's like the world's first virtual reality machine, because when a story is being told to you, the the function in your brain that processes actual reality lights up in the same way it lights up for a story. So basically, inside the brain, it doesn't know the difference between the reality and the story,
Right,
right?
right.
It feels very real.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
why we identify so much with the character, right? And the character is key here, because a lot of people think story is just, a series of things that happen, events that happen, right? But that's just plot. That's not an actual story. So if you just say, oh, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? Then it doesn't activate anything in the brain, because there's no one to relate it to.
Yeah.
If you said this happened, but because this happened, uh, the character, the protagonist, feels a certain way, right? It makes a certain impact, and the protagonist now makes a decision, right, which impacts others who also feel a certain way in response, which makes the character also feel a certain way, and then they respond. So now we find it relatable, because what we're really trying to do when we listen to a story, even though we don't do it consciously, is we're trying to learn how to decide in similar situations vicariously via the protagonist. We want to know, oh, like if I was in that situation, what might be a good way for me to decide?
Mm. Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's very interesting.
yeah.
I didn't realize that. I may be doing that as well,
Hmm.
especially in those situations that I've not been in, like in the wild or something, and you see a bear.
Exactly. Yeah,
I think those are important tips to learn.
exactly. And then, in fact, that's the exact example I give people, where, like, when fire was first discovered, like, a few centuries after it was discovered, uh, they didn't they didn't teach you how to make a fire, you know, by giving you instructions, right? Oh, you do this and then do this and do that. No, instead they told a story about the first time fire was discovered,
Mm,
and that's how people learned.
mm. Yeah, and I so personally, right, like storytelling, like my reality, I feel like my reality is created through this mental stories in my head, right?
Mhm.
And in that sense, like what I'm telling myself about what's happening in my life creates my reality than what is actually happening in my life. Because we have this storytelling mechanism inside of us that's constantly spitting out images. Like we have the imagination that's creating a story, not even creating, but it's illuminating a story that's already inside of us. The way we feel about something is, the essence of will be the essence of how we view life. And so if we feel a certain way, that's data that our imagination will take in and will create a story around this particular situation that's terrifying, or this particular situation that's causing a lot of fear or anger.
Mhm.
And because then our imagination will then spit that out onto the screen in our life. The screen is like, different people in our lives, the different situations in our lives. And so because of this whole process, like the stories that we tell about ourselves are the most important ones in our lives,
Mhm.
right? Like the ones that we internally tell about ourselves, what we wake up saying that, oh, you're not successful, you can't do it, or yeah, you can do it, you're gonna, like, so the internal dialogue that goes on in our mind uh, and I call those as stories because we're constantly telling these stories to ourselves about ourselves, and then also to other people about ourselves, about the way we carry ourselves, right? So uh, yeah, I feel like that's again, this is the book that I'm writing right now is about this topic. It's called What's Your Story, and understanding how these mental stories
Which is
are,
also the name of your show. Yeah.
which is also the name of the show. Yeah, and yeah, this is like I've had this "What's your story?" that phrase for a long time in my life, even before I was conscious about my storytelling mechanism. Uh, when I would talk to, I would be on dating apps and I'd start talking to people, and one of the first questions I would ask them is, "What's your story?" But that was, it started from there. It's like, "What's your story?" Like, you get to better know them. And a lot of the times you don't get a response because people are not there to share their stories. They're just, they're like more surface level. But yeah, that's kind of where it started, the phrase, and then I've kept it along with the show, and then now with this book, with the digital course that I'm creating, is also called "What's Your Story?" Um, Essentially, getting people to understand that we're creating stories at every moment of our lives, and then what's that story that we're creating? So let's create like a film for our whole life, understanding the different experiences in our past and how those experiences have affected us. Um, because I mean, at some point in my life, I had never self-introspected. I never sat down, had the time to sit down and just reflect on all of the experiences, all of the stuff that's happened in my life, and how that has shaped me into the person that I am today. And so I created this whole process like, hey, let's sit down, let's write out all of the experiences in your past from different age groups, 0 to 9, 10 to 11, 19, on and on and on. And write out each of your experiences, and then how has each of those experiences affected you and made you into who you are today. Let's understand that, because once you understand how you relate to those experiences, now you can start changing the story around it. You can start upgrading your stories around your past situations, and while you upgrade the stories about your past situations, you're also upgrading your future by creating a new story for yourself. There's kind of like a whole course around how can we create better stories to live a better life.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting you say that because Lisa Krohn has said something similar where he's because there's another level of looking at story in addition to the decision making part because the number one decision that we're making is about our own worldview. And oftentimes the most effective stories start with, in fact, the thing that the story starts with is also like the running theme throughout the story, you know. And that's an external, unavoidable, urgent escalating event. And it's not just any escalating event, it's an event that if our hero, our protagonist, gets through it and overcomes it, it might change their entire worldview, right?
Mm.
So something big is at stake, not only outside the protagonist, but also inside, something huge, something they're holding very dear to themselves. And in that worldview that holding on, it might have been useful to them in the past, but it's no longer serving them, but they're still holding on because they're still holding on to the past, right? And this external escalating event is forcing them to finally face it. That's what makes the most effective story.
Mm, right there. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've seen that in the people that have taken my course thus far,
Mhm.
and they have gotten to understand how certain experiences in their past have played a huge role in their life.
Mhm.
It's still like a huge role in terms of limitations. Like for example, um, one of the guys who took this course, he found out that when he was in high school, he was in a high school in an area in Los Angeles that had a lot of violence, a lot of bullying, and people getting beat up, different gang violences as well. And so he was attending this high school, and there have been several instances in his life where there were close calls he just missed, or he happened to there was like a bathroom that he would usually frequent, and that one day he didn't go. There was a shooting in that same bathroom,
Oh.
So things like that. So he had a lot of fear inside of him around like security and safety issues, right? So he wouldn't feel comfortable traveling by himself. He wouldn't feel comfortable in certain places. Like if the room didn't have if the room didn't have a fence, like a like how certain motels or yeah, convenience stores have those glass windows, but then outside of that they have that railing to protect them, those metal railings. So if the room didn't have those railings protecting the windows, he wouldn't feel safe in the room.
Mm.
So it's very limiting, right? And then he did this whole exercise, and then he found out about it. He learned more and he dove deeper into it, and he realized how that the whole high school period was affecting him even to this day.
Mm.
And he now he's able to travel by himself. He just recently, actually, right now, he's in went on a trip in the East Coast, all solo trip by himself, and then he ended up going to Sadhguru's ashram over there in Tennessee, and and he's taking a course over there as well. But traveling all by himself. So it's that kind of understanding those limitations and how the story that we have had carried with us for so long. Maybe now it's like very subtle inside of us, but we're still making decisions based off that story. And so it's like uncovering that, diving deeper and unearthing each of those experiences and how they have affected us and how we can improve on them.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So I have a similar story about story. Very meta, right? And and this goes to show what I'm trying to express about the power of reading other people's stories as a reflection to introspect about my own story, right? Even fictional stories, right? That I read. So I have had a similar experience about around safety, right? Because I grew up in a military dictatorship, as you know, right, in Myanmar, and the government at the time had institutional colorism, and they were also very xenophobic, anti-Hindu, anti-Indian, and and I'm Hindu, right? And so they, and this happened before I was even born, but I heard the stories, and even the stories themselves that I heard, I internalized, right? So the government seized they were also very Marxist, very socialist, right? So the government seized my grandfather's assets in a process that they call nationalization. They seized their businesses, right? And and they also, forced all the Indians to adopt foreign registration cards, whereas the Burmese would have national registration cards, right? So it's like basically they've already created a different class by forcing people to have a different card that they carry all the time, right? And and so like I felt, and then of course there was a democracy uprising where there was a lot of the government literally shooting down protesters and things like that, and then protesters themselves looting the government warehouse right next to my house, right? Uh, and and some of them, would even use our compound as a pathway to get into the government warehouse, which made my mom angry. They were like, "Why are you using our house?" That's why my parents ended up building later on big walls with like pointy broken glasses on top. They did that afterwards. Uh, but yeah, that happened, right? Uh, And so I grew up, because of all that, I grew up with a fear of loss. What's interesting about it is some people might use that experience to like become very greedy and stingy and, hoard a lot of money and save a lot of money. But for me, I had the opposite interpretation. I was like, oh, anything can be lost at any time,
Mm.
right? Money can be gone anytime. Money can be just taken away from me by a government or looters or whatever, right? So what's the point? What's the point of saving? And for years, like I had this thing, I was holding on to that, and so I didn't really have too much savings, because of that. Uh, Money would always go up and down. And then I read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, followed by Parable of the Talents, and that story is like no cup of tea. It's like very violent, and there's huge losses. There is like houses being burned down, like a lot of horrendous violence goes through that story, and I related to that story because I'm basically a child of war myself. In fact, I recently learned my country has gone through the longest running civil war in history, right? Even though I was never in the zones where people were actually shooting at each other, it still impacted me in a way, right? Because I was pretty, in a way, close, you know. And so, but in that story, like this protagonist, like, even though she experienced so much loss, like, she kept persevering and rebuilding and rebuilding. And she would especially try to rebuild community. That was key. And so I learned two lessons that really helped me break my pattern. I was like, oh, even if I lose, I can always rebuild. I do have the strength and energy for that, especially if I also am trying to build support networks, build communities like the character in that story. That's what flipped the switch. I'm like, oh my God, I gotta do community building so that I can just keep rebuilding even if I lose. So that was a total switch that, even years of, doing personal development work, like trying to do, work on my subconscious limiting beliefs and things like that. Uh, it didn't work for me because until I read that story, I didn't even know the story that was actually running me. Uh, and I kind of knew a little bit, but it was on a surface level. I didn't know on a deeper level until I was forced to face my story in a vicarious way through that main character. And because it's a fictional story, right, it gives me almost like a kind of like a little bit of a barrier to safely confront my own story.
Mm. A little bit of barrier to safely. So it's like a cushion for you. Like you felt comfortable.
Yeah. Even though that story is so horrific, on
Mm.
some level I knew like, oh, this is still fiction, right? Even though it's relatable. So
Right.
that gave me a sort of barrier to really confront my story. Yeah.
Mm. How long did it take after coming to that point of finally being able to confront your story? Um,
I think it took me consciously doing it because basically I flipped the neuroscience of storytelling back on myself. So instead of using it for writing, I use it for reading, where the same process that writers use to write an effective story, I ask myself, like, what is the main limiting belief or the overarching worldview that this character is going through, and how is that worldview shifting and why? Like, what is helping the character shift that worldview? When I ask those questions consciously, right, I started getting answers, and then I finally asked myself, okay, so how is all that relatable to me and my story? That's when like everything became clear.
mm, wow. Yeah, that's fascinating how reading stories can be very like healing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We don't have to all meditate or sit in a sound healing. We can just
Right, exactly. Yeah,
um, yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
yeah. What else do we want to talk about?
Oh, I also wanted to go back to some of the things you said earlier, when even even in your live yesterday, right? When you said, oh, you two had similar experiences, so you were able to bounce back on each other and kind of like learn from each other in that way in real time about like how you made certain decisions that helped you, how she made certain decisions that helped you. So again, like that really like helps with the decision making process as well. When you have meet uh, people who've had similar stories to you,
Yeah,
similar but also slightly different, right? Yeah.
yeah, and it's happened many times in my life where someone will share their story with me, and I'll be like, huh, I've actually had something similar that happened in my life,
Mhm.
but I didn't, it wasn't like part of my story consciously until I heard that story from the other person, and then it jogged my memory, and I'm like, oh, I've lived this through, and then then the story comes up. I make it, what is my relationship to that story? Is there an empowering version of it? Like, can I use this to empower me to push me forward? If not me, empower me, and then empower other people as well to make it part of my, talks that I do, or when I'm interviewing with you, for
Yeah.
example, bring it up and help it to inspire other people as well.
Mhm.
Uh, so yeah, it's
Yeah.
like very important to hear other people's stories, and that's the same thing as reading a book. Uh, you know,
Yeah, that's why I read memoirs as well in addition to fiction because they also help in a different way, but they also help as well, you know. And because with memoirs, those are the real experiences of a real person, they they help in a way that makes the lesson more real, right? Because now I'm like, oh, this person went through this challenge and overcome it for real, you know. Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's doable. If that person did it, then why can't I do it?
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, yeah, even conversations like this, right? We are co-creating each other's stories in real time, and and now we become part of each other's story. So conversations are also powerful for that. Yeah. And yeah. Another thing I wanted to say is even on this live, right? When I was so talking about the 4 stages of the creative process, if I just told you the 4 stages, right, which I did in the beginning, it didn't hit as much as it did when I started giving examples of lived experiences, like
Mm.
Sade, like Paul McCartney, right, and my own experiences. That's when I started telling those stories, that's when it becomes more real, more impactful.
Mm. And it becomes more impactful for you and your mind space, right?
In my mind as well, yeah, yeah.
And it's like further imprinting that for you,
Hmm.
like imprinting those values, imprinting the feeling. Yeah, yeah, I've definitely agree with that. Yeah, and that's the same thing that happened with my guest yesterday, Dr. Mansi Vera. As she was going through her disease, as she was living her experience, it further strengthened her resolve to pursue the path of naturopathic medicine, as opposed to allopathic medicine, because in her experience, allopathic medicine didn't really work.
Hmm.
But when she went to India and tried out the Panchkarma methods in India, she saw she saw that there was noticeable changes. Even though her disease didn't completely go away, she was able to live with it when before she was in a lot of pain. So while she was sharing her story, she was realizing certain things, but I was also realizing certain things about my life. So yeah, it's storytelling is very fascinating, and I feel like more people have to do more of it to be able to understand our own stories.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate you coming here. Let us know your yeah, like where we can find you and what the work you do, etc. Your show, etc.
Yeah, the show is called What's Your Story Show, and